Today we're talking to Tara Walker all about life as a labor law lawyer. If you're new here, I'm Lavetta Jenkins, guest host of Break Into Law School, and today I'm joined with Tara Walker, who practices in all areas of labor and employment law. Now, she found her way from an LLM in Europe to a Juris Doctor here in the United States. And of course, I'm going to want to know all about that. She now works for Bernstein Shur, who were one of the sponsors for the second annual Break Into Law conference. And we were so happy that they were a part that I felt I needed to know more about Tara. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to have you on. So, you had an unconventional kind of getting to law. Tell me more about yourself.
Yeah, I grew up in a very tiny town in rural Alaska. So my hometown has a population of about 350. I grew up in Cooper Landing, Alaska. If anybody is really hardcore into salmon fishing, they might know it, but otherwise it's barely a dot on the map. I'm the first generation in my family, other than my sister, to go to college. And so I really had no idea what to expect in going to college, and especially not in going to law school. Really didn't have that background in my family. Applied to a number of colleges, totally sight unseen, and had a bit of a culture shock when I went to college in Washington, D.C., coming from, such a small town.
So you said that it was super small in Alaska and you guys focused on salmon fishing. And I want to know more. How did you end up going from literally one side to the other, going from Alaska to DC to study law?
So it really didn't start out that way. I didn't know that I was going to go to law school right away. It took me a long time to sort of decide that I wanted to become a lawyer, especially when I graduated high school. I didn't know any lawyers. I didn't know what the practice was ever going to be like. So I really started out by going with what I knew at the time, which was Russian, actually. So I was a Russian studies major in undergrad, and I ended up, it was kind of by chance, that was the foreign language that they taught in Alaska at the time. It wasn't Spanish or French or one of the other more common languages that people learn as a second language in the lower 48. So I ended up picking colleges that had good Russian programs. And that's how I ended up in DC. Over time, I think maybe when I got my feet under me at college, I just remember, it kind of reminds me when you're asking this, kind of illustrating this culture shock. I was standing in line, I remember, for the very first time when I showed up to college to get my dorm room assignment. And there was a big long line of people, and my mom was there with me, and we were behind this other mother and daughter. They were talking about Burberry. And I had this very distinct memory of turning to my mom and thinking, like, what weird berries they must have here. I'm used to raspberries and salmon berries, but I've never heard of a Burberry before. So it was a little bit of a culture shock to understand that's not what they were talking about.
I love it. I love it. And to your point of them teaching Russian as a second language, I think for most of us, you learn the language of the country closest to you. And it takes me back to the days when I first heard Sarah Palin say that she could see Russia from her house. So, in all fairness, in Alaska, if that's the closest kind of place to you, then I would say that you probably would learn Russian on that side.
Yeah, there's a lot of really strange communities that are still there from when Alaska belonged to Russia. They're pretty cut off and they are native Russian speaking. They speak a very old version of Russian. It'd be like Old English to us. So that's how I started to go to college and be in DC. And it was really only years later when I was trying, I still wasn't sure I wanted to be a lawyer even after I graduated from college. I was debating between a number of different opportunities. And so I thought possibly maybe I would be interested in going into academia or doing something like that. And that's when I decided to do an LLM in Europe to kind of help me figure out if this whole law thing was for me.
And that's what I wanted to know. You went from Alaska to DC to Europe for an LLM. What led you there? Now, you said to go over there, but is there something different about learning it there as opposed to here?
100%. So it's completely different. It's civil law based. I was one of two Americans in the entire program. The way that most countries do law school is not like the way we do in the States. They usually do a 5 year combined undergraduate and graduate program, an LLB. And we do our traditional undergrad and then 3 years for the JD. So most of the people that I was in school with were either already graduated from law school with their LLB, or they were practicing lawyers. Some of them were practicing judges in their home countries. And that program was I did comparative constitutional law. So we took constitutions from every country or major countries and studied the systems that were in place for those countries. So we studied German basic law. England was mind boggling because everything is the Constitution or nothing is the Constitution in the English system, depending on who you ask. And we studied the French Constitution. We did a lot of different case studies, which was really fascinating because you got to interact with people who were from everywhere.
I can imagine. So, being a layman myself, most people on the outside of law would think that the law is the law in almost every country and they are pretty much cookie cutter the same, except for in some extreme cases. What was the biggest difference you would say from one country to this one?
It's so interesting to look at that in the context of constitutional law, right? Too, because these are the most basic and fundamental rights. We're often talking about people's humanity, right? The right to live. So, some of the cases that we studied or experiences that people shared, for example, came from the Indian system, where they had constitutional debates about constitutional rights to food, which was just, you know, earth shattering to me. I think about the amendments to our Constitution and the defined set of rights there, and thinking about how expansive could that be to cover all of your basic human needs would be really fascinating. So it led to a lot of really interesting discussions on how other people conceptualize what are the most important and fundamental rights. The German system is a really good another example we spent a lot of time with, right? Because their central post, World War II, and central to their system is the inherent dignity of people. And what would happen if we conceptualize rights and what we allocate to people based on that notion instead of looking at speech and when is speech allowed or assembly, freedom of the press? It really changes the way you start to think philosophically about what the law does.
There are a lot of things we take for granted here in the United States, and we often think that, yeah, it's just our right. But I know that there are other countries who you literally have to write that in to say that, this is the right you get. And then there are some that are probably a little bit more progressive than us. So you mentioned some of the German language. Which country do you think you learned the most about while you were studying abroad?
I think it actually, I don't think I could say just one. It was actually taking a little bit of flavors from each system. There are pros and cons to everything, right? And sometimes having a really defined document, as we've seen, right? We get in arguments about, is this supposed to be the original intent of the people who wrote this way back when, or are we supposed to interpret this as a more living document? Maybe we can pull from the English system and just follow whatever we want. We can pull a flavor from the Indian system or from, some decisions that are coming out of the European Court of Human Rights around prison conditions. We did a lot of work, actually. We had a clinic that we worked on there where we traveled to a women's prison in Poland, and we got to see the conditions of confinement for the women that were there. And it's a lot more robust than what we have in the United States in terms of the rights that are guaranteed. So we were talking a lot about spatial diameter, right? Like how big the cells are, how much outside time you get, your food every day that you get. Those kind of rights are much more expansive than what we have here. And I found it really inspiring to come back. And I think especially when you get into the law, people get very closed off into their jurisdiction. You don't go look to other states, and certainly you don't go look to other countries. to go find what the law is. That's not going to tell you what we do here, especially in America, right? We have a little bit of hubris around that. We're going to do it this way because it's the right way. And I found it so inspiring to be able to pull from a lot of different, like, we actually don't necessarily have all the best ideas. Maybe there's a way we can be creative to pull ideas from other places that we can use here.
And that was my next question. In learning all you did from different countries and about different things, how did that affect the way you view policies and laws that pertain to labor and employment?
I think probably in labor and employment, it's a little bit less. But just before I joined Bernstein, Shur, and I was the legal and policy director of the ACLU of Alaska. So I was living back in my home state, and I was doing all constitutional law. And I think that's where the rubber hit the road for me on some of those earlier lessons that I had learned in that program, because I could start to ask questions like, maybe we should bring a case that talks about, we actually seem to have this right to shelter in our constitution. Alaska has one of the broadest constitutions. It's one of the latest, right? For obvious reasons, that was drafted in the country. And then it just is exceptionally broad wording. And many of the rights that are stated in there have never been interpreted by any court decision anywhere. And so it led to a lot of really productive discussion between my colleagues and I about, I wonder what we could do with this, maybe walking around and seeing immense suffering. You see people who are homeless there, and it is so cold. They literally don't have anywhere to go. If they stop walking in the night, they will freeze to death. So when you drive home, or it's dark most of the time during the day, you will see people walking constantly around the city of Anchorage, even sometimes outside the city, but very often you'll see just the street lights within the city and just people walking all night long and to stay alive. It did inspire us to try to think of ways that we can bring that right to life and think about how to protect those people.
I don't think I've ever put more thought in the right to life until this very moment. Because if you don't know a thing, you don't know it. But once you know it, it's up to you what you do with that information. And that really hit home to know that some people are just walking to stay alive, to stay warm, to stay moving. And I know that had to affect the way you look at law and policies in your entire kind of career working in labor and employment law. What's the biggest change that you've seen, and where do you think we could improve?
By far, the biggest change that I've seen in my career has been in the Me Too movement, and the way that we handle sexual harassment in the workplace, rape allegations, at least in our firm. And I know in my own work, I do both labor and employment law, but also I do a lot of work with colleges, universities, and schools around sexual misconduct. So sometimes this is also called Title IX cases. Complainants have allegations of sexual misconduct, which can include sexual assault in some cases, sexual harassment, dating violence, those kinds of things. There has been a complete cultural shift in our country in recent decades. I think even in recent years, I'm watching it take place now industry by industry. That's still happening. I think there were some earlier industries that tended to be more aware of these issues and responsive, and some that are only just now becoming aware and making changes to improve working conditions so that everybody can feel safe. I think that's been fascinating to watch because there's internalized lessons we can take for a lot of different contexts. But it has just been about taking allegations seriously, responding to them, being extremely thorough with how we respond to them. And, that to me has been pretty inspiring to see. I think a lot more people feel safe at work than they did at the start, certainly at the start of the Me Too movement.
And I want to park right there for a second. I was just having a conversation with someone the other day about languages that were formally used in office settings and the way you could joke around with, other coworkers or coworkers of the opposite sex, ways that for a long time women have felt uncomfortable with, but we kind of have to laugh it off so that you keep your job. And now it's more so, it's making everyone aware that those little jabs or those little pieces that you think are funny are actually harassment. And I think that throughout the work that you have done and other people who have worked with labor and employment, there's been a change and there's a shift in the language that everyone uses. And we now know, yeah, you might think it's funny, or some, people around the office, the water cooler may think it's funny, but it's actually offensive.
Totally. I heard a really excellent description of this, which I happen to tell a lot of my clients because I do think I end up encountering a lot of what I think are very well meaning and earnest, men in the workplace. I don't want to say this is all just breaking down totally on gender lines because I don't think it does. But these questions predominantly come from men who say, I really have never thought of myself as sexist. I've never thought of myself as a harasser, but I wonder if I can predict where the line is. And so we talk about this notion of jokes. And I think it's a really important conversation to have because it illustrates exactly this point where you say, okay, let's imagine that you tell a joke and it's very close to the line. Maybe it's over the line, depends on your perspective. But now you've got someone who's in the room. We'll use the typical or the stereotypical me as the young associate or in the room, for example, as a female associate, and it's a joke about women. I have a choice to make in that situation. I can either try to laugh it off and let it roll off my back, but now I'm seen as being game for that kind of thing. I think it's funny. And now, anytime someone comes up with a joke, I am understood to put up with it. Or I can say, hey, that's not really that funny, or I don't find that funny. And the response is, I'm seen as a prude. And maybe if it's the person who's telling the joke as the lead partner, I don't get that next case that's really juicy and interesting. Or I don't get called into the important client meeting because they're worried about what I might say. And at the end of the day, I think everybody could understand I, as that person who's hearing the joke, am spending an enormous amount of time and emotional bandwidth trying to navigate the joke that shouldn't really have been told in the first place. So I think once that, concept, all these open conversations and people coming together have been able to take place, people do start to internalize it, starts to turn the tide a little bit. So those can become a thing of the past.
I loved every second of that because that is how it starts. It's oftentimes people who don't see that as offensive because it's not them or it's not directed at, their group. But a lot of things that, once were said long time ago are bad. If you've ever watched an episode of any old sitcom, it's cringy now, but it was funny then. And a lot of times women get put in places where we have to laugh it off simply because you don't want to be seen as that girl or sensitive or, oh, she's being a woman. And I think that that has a lot to do with the labor and employment laws. Yes, the laws do protect everyone, but we've seen great strides in the industry because the original laws weren't necessarily written with us in mind. Have you seen that to be the case as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of change happening at the moment. And where I see a lot of really fun and interesting change is at the state level. For example, where I practice in Maine, there have been a lot of really interesting and substantial changes to the law to protect gender expression that had never occurred prior to. And we were one of the earliest states. There were a lot of inspiring conversations around pay equity that are happening in our state. And I think we have one of the most restrictive laws in the country on paying men and women, and we've just added this year paying people on the basis of race, equal pay for comparable work. So I think that is happening. I do think those laws were often created at a time when, there weren't a lot of women in the workforce, or, issues around DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion were not as prevalent as they are now, but I can see a lot of movement in the law as well. And I think that gives me a lot of work, gives my clients a lot of things to understand, but it's all progress.
Listen, if we all have to put in a little bit more work and apply a little bit more elbow grease so that the future generations have it a little bit better, I think that that's a good trade off. I'm thinking now of all of the things that you've done, you've been able to accomplished. You were once a law clerk and you've done tons of things on almost all sides of the law. What would you say you want your mark to be left on the world, when you do decide to hang up your hat and retire? Or what do you hope to teach the lawyers coming behind you?
Oh, I have two answers to that, and I'm going to pull them apart if that's okay. Because I have a heart goal of my entire career and my life, and that has been with me, I think, since I started going into prisons and studying, and that would be to end solitary confinement anywhere it's happening, particularly with children right now. That would be a legacy I would like to contribute to. I don't know how far I'll ever get, but that's really important to me. But your question really reminded me of something. You described that I've had a lot of experiences. I feel extremely fortunate to have had the experiences that I've had. I feel glad that I come from a state where people are pretty down to earth, both in Alaska and now where I'm practicing in Maine. People are very open to new experiences, new people. And if you call them up and ask them for a job, they'll give it to you. But I still have like imposter syndrome and have always had imposter syndrome going throughout college, of course, right? You get there and it's like, I do not belong here. I am not one of these people. And I don't know how they let me in here. That continued even when I moved abroad. I don't speak the language. It's very destabilizing to feel like you can't communicate what you might need to be able to communicate. Gave me a lot of empathy for people who move to this country and maybe trying to learn a new language and get a job or provide for their family. I think that's an experience everybody should have. To get your little card as being a human, you should at least go somewhere where you don't speak the language. And law school too, I didn't always have perfect grades, and it doesn't mean you can't go far and you can't do a lot and keep your confidence, even if you are somebody like me who didn't have a lot of models growing up for people to look ahead to and say, I want to be like that person, right? You're just kind of creating the road and the path and hoping that you're driving the car in the right direction as you go along. Trust your confidence in your gut and your instinct in yourself. I hope that's the lesson that I leave with people, because it's never been obvious to me that I deserved any of this. I still question it to this day. I remember one of the very first experiences I ever had when I got to college. I was in a dorm room with some students that were all sitting around, and somehow this is probably a very, I don't know, freshman college nervous conversation to have at the time. Everybody was going around and saying their SAT scores, and it came around to me. And I said I don't remember honestly what my SAT score was, but it was solidly middle of the road. One of the other students in that room looked at me and said, really? How did you get here? Essentially was his implication. Where are you from? He asked. And I told them that I was from Alaska. And he said, oh, you must be a diversity kid. And I left that room in tears, completely devastated, knowing I didn't belong there, knowing that I didn't. And you know what? I did belong there. Probably more than he did. And I just hope that everybody knows there are a lot of people who are very confident that they should be there, but nobody deserves that more than you. You can forge your own path and find your way there just like they did. You don't need models. You're not missing anything that anybody else has. You just have to work hard, right? And care and really enjoy it, I think. And then it'll be a meaningful career. So I really hope that's part of what I can leave behind.
I love that you said you do belong. Even though there are days, all of us feel like, what am I do? How did I get here? What am I doing here? It's good to remind ourselves that wherever you are, that is where you belong. Now, can you aim higher? Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you get there, you belong there. There's been times, almost everyone in every career has had to stop and go, how did I get here? Hard work will get you to the good places, and you just have to believe that you deserve them. And I think that you are now still realizing that, yeah, you deserve to have good things. You deserve all the accolades and everything that you've had come to you. I want to back up just a bit and ask you this question because I know you did things kind of in the reverse with the LLM and the JD. Was it hard to go for one before the other and then come back here to get the JD after you've gotten the LLM? How did that, what made you make that specific decision?
I think I made that decision really to evaluate whether I wanted to go to law school. It was less of a commitment. It was only 1 year, but it was hard. It was hard because everyone else around me had a baseline understanding of the law that I did not have. Any of the people potentially watching this podcast who are either in law school or who have gone to law school, it's tough. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you learn over those 3 years, and I skipped it. It didn't mean, I mean, luckily, I think because it was such a specialized area, I was able to pick up on the constitutional law aspects of what I needed to know to get through those classes. But even just how do courts work, how do decisions get made, the appellate process, all the civil procedure issues that you learn when you're in law school, I didn't have the benefit of. So that was challenging. I think it was worth doing though, because the learning curve was a little bit steeper, but I got a lot out of it. There was a lot of information that when I go to my JD and go back to law school, I had these foundational elements of that really were, I think, provocative and interesting with some of the professors, and provided a much more rounded perspective when we were learning things, even in criminal law, right? You've got certain constitutional elements there, civil procedure, right? And then common law, of course.
So, do you think that it made it a little bit harder in the beginning and then easier in the ending to get that JD because you had already been through the LLM?
Yeah, definitely. I think it made the JD easier. It was harder to go through the LLM first without having that foundation. But once I did that, it made going to law school and getting the JD easier.
That's exactly what I like to hear. Sometimes you do have to take a little hard road first so that the scenery on that next trip can be a little bit better. And I think that that is exactly what you mastered by doing it exactly the way you did. It seems as if you're even taking law and employment and labor laws into your own hands and navigating those on your own path and the way you want to do it. So, to wrap this up and to kind of bring it home and make it a little bit more personal, tell us all what a typical day looks like for a labor law lawyer.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have necessarily a typical day, but most of my days are spent handling at least one dumpster fire, at least some regular client questions, and then I do a lot of litigation. So that would normally look like a client who calls me up and says, "Oh my God, my hair's on fire. You have to help this person. We were about ready to terminate because they had, done terrible things and threatened violence. And I just learned they're pregnant. What can I do?" Questions like that, normal policy related questions. So, updating people's policies, making their workplaces more inclusive, changing things to help people adapt to the changing laws. And then in litigation, it can be anything. So, a typical day might look like preparing for a deposition, writing out questions that I know I want to ask when we get to depositions, or drafting a motion that I know I'm going to file in court in the next couple of weeks. Position statements, it's another really common one that I'm preparing for the Human Rights Commission or Equal Opportunity Commission for cases that are pending. And I also do, I don't want to cut this out, I do pro bono. I try to spend a significant amount of my time. Right now, I'm working, because of my Russian background, I'm working with an asylum applicant in Maine from Russia who's an indigenous rights activist, actually. And so that's current pro bono, but typically I'll do anything from ACLU cases still to asylum immigrants cases, and sometimes legal services. We have a good legal services agency here. So that's usually a part of my day, I hope.
So, for anyone who's thinking of getting into this particular avenue of law, what would you tell an aspiring labor law lawyer?
I think it's the most fun area. So if you're not sure which area of law you want to be in, I'll tell you why I chose this one, because I tried out a lot of the other ones and they were ungodly boring. I do not want to do property disputes. It's a lot of litigation, but I'm not going to argue over where the line is. And big toxic tort litigation, you can get lost in documents for years. It just all sounds very boring. So labor and employment law, I think they're at the end of the day, you're dealing with real people, real issues, and you're at the forefront of working on issues around equal access and making sure people are included in the workplace. And that's really exciting. So it's always fun. The cases are always interesting. We're running up and down the hallways like, get a load of this with our colleagues, sharing stories of different experiences that we all have. I think if you want to get into that area of law, just pursue it. Reach out to people. One thing that I think people are sometimes hesitant to do is to reach out to people that they find on the internet or that they can research and identify. That has helped me. One of probably the most significant things in my career that have helped me. I literally called judges that I wanted to clerk for and I asked them, can I clerk for you or can I intern for you? I've called practitioners and said, can I meet you? People can email me and say, can we just have a Zoom coffee or something like that? People are far more willing to do that than you expect. So reach out to people in your area that are doing that law. I'd like to hear about how you got into it. Those are really great resources. When you do go and apply for that job, you now know them.
All right. So, for any listener or viewer who wanted to know more about you, where can they find you on social media or on websites?
My social media is like from the dinosaur era. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Tara Walker. You can go to my firm's website. My bio is there. So that's bernsteinshur.com, or you can Google Tara Walker, Maine attorney, and you will find me. My email address is right there. You can always feel free to email me through our web portal. That's totally fine. And then I do have an Instagram, but I don't remember what my handle is.
Listen, you're busy. You don't have time for all this social media stuff, and I 100% understand. But to anybody who's looking into getting into labor law, you just might have another question, reach out on her company's website. Thank you so much, Tara, for being on with us today. I greatly appreciate you sharing your story.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I think this is awesome. I wish something like this existed for me when I was trying to come up all the way through all these steps. And so I hope that other people get to hear it and are inspired.
And they absolutely will.